thank you for inviting me to be part of this initiative. First of all, I apologise for the slightly croaky voice. I've not long got out of bed for the flu. I loved the title, Beyond Good Intentions, and I really relate to that because I find that my book, Richland, Wasteland, inspires many readers to turn the shock, the distress and the anger into action, to do whatever they can to right the wrongs that the book makes them aware of. In fact, it was one lady from Canberra who did so very directly by turning around and buying 100 more copies of the book after she read it, and she sent them, each accompanied with a private letter, to 100 politicians saying they have to know the harm that they are doing to us. Now, since the book came out, which was in May last year, I've given about 95 talks in 3 states, all on invitation, not arranged by the publishers, and that to me shows the scale of concern nationally about this mining and drilling mania. And at those talks, they would often show this documentary, Bimblebox. I don't know if you've had it in Canberra, but I'm donating this to the schools so that I'm hoping that you will also get a chance to have the accompanying visual shock about what's happening around Australia with coal and coal seam gas. Bimblebox is a nature refuge. In Queensland, the Galilee Basin, it'll be the first nature refuge to be dug up, and it's Clive Palmer who wants to dig it up. Now, those 95 talks, the organisers and the audiences at them were indeed representative of the fringe extremists of whom the government and the industry warn you about. They ranged from the CWA, Probus, town and country libraries, the Anglican Synod, very, very conservative rural groups like Property Rights Australia, and many concerned community groups, including the real baddies that are out to subvert our economy and our society, the knitting nanas against gas, the nanas. And I should also admit to having fans in the mafia, the mothers against fracking in Australia. Some events were put on by groups with words like environment or conservation in their name, but these are not dirty words. And rather than being at odds with jobs and the economy, they are integral. There are no jobs and no profit on a dead planet. Similarly, I've been too narrowly called an environmental activist. So I invented my own term, common sense activist. I act on behalf of a return to common sense, like not fouling our own nest or killing the goose that lays the golden eggs, if you want to be more practical, a la the Great Barrier Reef and tourism, for example, or our food-producing areas like the Liverpool Plains, the Darling Downs or Gippsland, or any source of clean water on this, the driest of all continents. The late Bryce Courtenay said it, and I don't often quote him, but it's not about being a greenie, it's about not being stupid. Now, I used not to be an activist of any sort. I'm afraid to admit it. At uni, when they were marching for a moratorium on the Vietnam War, I think I was in a pub somewhere discussing poetry or something. That wasn't my experience. But by the late 1990s, I couldn't ignore what unbridled open-cut coal mining and coal power were being allowed to do to the people and places, the air and water of the once rural Hunter Valley. That 50 kilometres between Singleton and Muswellbrook is now all massive open-cut mines. The industry boasts of that. They are so continuous that they are visible from space. But it's not as a scar, it's a running open sore on the earth, ever expanding and ever polluting. I'm a couple of hours away from there in the Upper Hunter. I'm not impacted. But my first grandchild was born in Singleton in 2000. And by 2006, my daughter had born 2 more daughters. Now, they had to breathe that visibly foul air, but Singleton by then was officially, with Lithgow, one of the most polluted areas in Australia from coal and coal power. The state average for reduced lung function in children is 1 in 9. In Singleton, it's 1 in 3. So, if coal was this out of control elsewhere, I realised there would be nothing left for all our grandchildren to inherit but ill health in a dewatered and contaminated wasteland. Well, what could I do about it? I only had one weapon, away with words. So I felt driven to write this book, Richland, Wasteland, very different from my other 2, Woman on the Mountain and Mountain Tales. Now, they were more about this feral grandma, that's me, and the creatures with whom I share my remote mountain wildlife refuge, living simply, sustainably and solar powered. But even in those first books, lighter books, much easier to read and to write, threaded through the nature writing, the selective memoir and the retrospectively humorous adventures with the snakes or the chainsaw, were several of my serious concerns. I wrote them to reach beyond the converted, to sow seeds of awareness that man is part of the natural world. He is not outside it or in control of it, as nature is now demonstrating so vehemently in the climate chaos of global warming. So, in my first book, Australia holds the shameful record of having wiped out the most mammal species of any country in the world. And we've done it in only a little over 200 years. We've been rotten caretakers compared to the original ones who managed it so well for thousands of years. It's way past time that as a species, we human animals got it right and how we value and treat what's left of our natural world. And we don't have much time to stop the ticking carbon clock. To me, the key of the whole issue is in the word respect. And we need to go back to the roots of our own race and to that of the word. The Latin word meaning to look, so respect, that's from, you get words like spectator, spectacles, etc. So it really means to look again. If we can cast aside our acquired blindness, we might actually see the natural world to which we belong, its richness, diversity and importance beyond ourselves, and regain respect for it. Perhaps then we'd stop trashing it. My philosophy of living is really simple, and I've had it since I was about 9 years old, and I got it from Charles Kingsley's Water Babies, from a character called Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By. I was very impressed by that, but I only used to apply it to human relationships. Since then, I'm trying to extend it to all creatures, even almost to the leeches that bedevil my place. But it's based on the premise that being different from humans is not a reason for superiority and exploitation, but rather for learning more. We used to kill whales before we realised how intelligent and complex they are, how more like us. How can they, we now say of pro-whaling nations? But I don't feel that the right of a species to survive ought to depend on its degree of similarity to us, or whether it's of any use to us. It's an intrinsic right as part of the whole wonderful natural world, that's biodiversity. We simply don't know enough about how all things were designed to work together, ecosystems, and we usually don't find out until it's too late. As Dr. David Suzuki says, we tear at the very web of life that makes this planet habitable. And we think we rule the planet because we're so clever. Well, oh dear, we have lots to learn, and we could do well to learn from the Valerie's Afar or from our first people, I would say. So, with my publisher's blessing, doing as I would be done by, I spent 2010 travelling around 5 states, gathering the real-life stories from the people in the path of this resources rush. And I did that because I'm a very visual person. I needed to see for myself the damage, and they did not match the spin that we were getting from government and industry. I was shocked to find a massive industrial invasion, a taking over of land and a clearing out of people by mainly foreign forces and with full government support for the second time in our history. Clearing out the country is nothing new in Australia. Although the weapons aren't muskets this time, I see some similarities with the poison flower and the water holes. But it wasn't only coal that was out of control. There was also its sneaky offsider, coal seam gas. I then spent another whole year researching how this could possibly be happening in Australia, and I found out that it was legalised looting, thanks to our loose and biased mining and petroleum laws, at best, given the New South Wales ICAC results. So for over 2 years, this book monopolised my mind and my heart, and I can tell you it near broke both at times. I'm a writer, a storyteller, I'm an academic or a journalist. I didn't want to just present readers with a collection of dry, if horrific, facts. I wanted to also offer a vivid narrative to let the voices of the victims touch the hearts of ordinary Australians, hoping that they would then stand up and say, hey, this is not the Australia we want to be or need to be. despite the spin that you are all being fed. What I found was that bigger and mostly foreign companies were now daring to push into hither unthinkable places of agricultural, environmental or cultural value. Governments were willing to risk our most precious treasures, like the Great Artesian Basin to coal seam gas, free, unlimited access to deep water that they have, or the Great Barrier Reef to massive coal port expansions. If they get going with the mines in the Galilee Basin, that's what we're going to have. But they would do that continually mouthing offensively empty assurances that the impacts would be unlikely to be significant, or that the impacts could be managed and mitigated. They never say no impact or no project. The corporate tactics that the victims recounted to me were calculated, very callous, and clearly from the same instruction manual. State planning departments were blatantly on the side of industry, not of the impacted environments or the communities. The lack of truth and transparency routinely went beyond spin to what the victims insist were lies. Wallaa, a little village north of Mudgee, 50 k's north of Mudgee, is a typical example. To win local support for the Peabody Wilpinjong mine, to marginalise any objectors, as spoil sport green is, the villagers were promised progress, growth, jobs for all, no bad impacts. Yet just 5 years after that mine began, the entries for Wallaa in the phone book had dropped from 96 to 12 as it became unlivable. And that's about a year ago, so it's probably less. Such coal refugees fled over to the coast mostly, where many of them now find themselves under CSG exploration. And I've done lots of talks on the coast, and I've re-met lots of those people, and I can tell you that many of them are still in post-traumatic stress states. The impacts on people's mental and physical health, the derailing of all their plans and prospects, and the deliberate destruction of their communities is shameful. It's hard enough to lose all the places and the people where your family have lived for generations if it's for something like the common good, let's say a highway. But when it's just so, some private company can make money at the expense of everything you value, it's intolerable. All along the coal chain, from the mines themselves to the uncovered coal stockpiles and the rail wagons uncovered to the coal ports, ordinary folk are fighting to protect the health and futures of their people and their water from the obvious dangers. I was once naive enough to think that that was the role of government. We're now seeing the same along the CSG chain, from the gas fields, dreadful health problems at the Tara gas fields in Queensland, along the pipeline routes thousands of kilometres to the LNG ports. All these people have had their lives taken over, under stress, waking each day to a looming threat, unfair and unacceptable impacts. Not to mention the guaranteed impact on our world as we base our economy on fuelling global warming with coal and now with methane's fugitive emissions. Methane acts so much faster, it doesn't last as long, we don't have long. It acts so much faster than CO2, especially in these next decades when we most need to slow it. My bumper sticker says, coal costs the earth. Well, so does methane. Now this all sounds insane, and it is. It was the word that came to my mind all the time I was writing this book. And it also sounds unstoppable, but I don't believe that's so. Now my sort of rich land can only exist with things riches that dollars can't buy really, personal health and well-being, freedom of choice, attachment to place, for example, certainly clean air and a sustainable clean food and water supply, a stable and secure society, and the preservation of irreplaceable natural environments. All those values are being adversely impacted, being taken away from us and from future generations, and that will affect people in the cities as much as in the country. My sort of rich land only exists where triple bottom line, full cost accounting, people, planet and profit is respected. Not the case in current Australia where profit too often harms both. In fact, the New South Wales Government, just this last week, is proposing to legislate to enshrine that imbalance regarding major mining and gas projects to make sure that it can't be overturned. A court recently overturned an approval for a Rio Tinto mine after the village appealed against it because it would have killed that village of Bulga. Well, that won't happen again because our government's going to legislate that the primary consideration must be the resource. They can't meet the air, noise and God, what the other criteria was that will harm the people, too bad. The rich land on the cover of my book is the Bylong Valley. You may have heard that name to do with the ICAC hearings. It's under threat from coal. The Wasteland is Ravensworth Mine in the Hunter. Not very long ago, Ravensworth was a village. We've lost way too many to coal. Our sustainable rich lands ought to be valued more than the wishes of private companies to dig up a one-off resource, make great profits and take them home, tipping our governments on the way via the royalty system. We mustn't forget they don't actually pay for the resource itself, and that the current scale of these industries is nothing to do with keeping the lights on for Australia. And by that I mean coal and gas. They're mainly for export and they're mainly foreign owned. Now this coal and gas rush is bringing truly serious dewatering, pollution, health and landowner rights issues, but also broader social ones. The 12-hour shifts, the trend to fly in, fly out community involvement, even in and work camps, even in non-remote areas like Fingleton, the fracturing of families, the loss of identity in corporatised rural towns, and the homelessness, as the double the average mine wages split towns and the nations into haves and have-nots. You know, we actually aren't obliged to keep trashing our country and our society to satisfy a self-destructive demand elsewhere. Demand's just a market. And as people have woken up to this, I'm seeing disillusionment and frustration turning to determination and action. In threatened areas, even the most conservative people, mainly farmers, have realised that changing to coalition governments, this is particularly Queensland and New South Wales, didn't help. That despite all the promises, they are equally, if not more, ready to keep the blinkers on and see only the dollars and not the damage. People power is the only thing left in our hands since reason and right and forward thinking have been removed from the system. We've got the Environmental Defenders Office under great threat. Battling community groups can no longer get legal aid. Goliath is getting more muscle, while the powers that be don't even want David to have a slingshot. I've got many reasons to think that a tipping point is fast approaching and to be hopeful. Hundreds of community action groups are sprung up. Block the Gate is a national movement. Court cases are proliferating. New tactics like divestment are being explored. Councils and churches and public bodies like the AMA are speaking out. And civil disobedience is now an accepted option. They are calling the bad laws into question, as Jesus did. And it's because the industries see this social resistance that they've launched a major campaign. You may have started seeing the ads, $5 million PR campaign to tell us how wonderful CSG is and why we need it. And they have government backing in what feels like a war against its own people. From the people's side, it feels like a fight for survival, to save an Australia under invasion. Our government has no plans for future sustainable revenue or jobs as the boom busts. And with about 85% of Australian coal mines foreign owned, we're at their mercy. Already, the price of coal has plummeted. World economists are warning that investment in thermal coal, that's for energy as opposed to coking coal for steel, is over. Thousands of jobs have already been cut. 4 mines that I know of have already been closed and new projects mothballed. This is a national issue, and the federal government needs to take more responsibility, not less, as Mr Abbott is threatening. They could at the very least remove fossil fuel subsidies, which is delaying the urgent move to renewable, zero emissions energy. And I'm biased because I've been on standalone solar for 20 years. This is a critical year to make this a politically expedient issue. Even if the spin about these industries' economic value were true, Australia should not be staying afloat economically on the pain of its people and the destruction of its life support systems for water and food. It's time we insisted that our governments think beyond politics and become leaders. They need to rediscover principles and rearrange their priorities, but they won't do it unless we demand it. So I ask everybody to add their voices to the people in this book. Tell your politicians at all levels and in all the media you can manage. Tell your family, your friends, your real ones and your Facebook ones, that you won't let them keep treating Australians as just collateral damage and Australia as fair game for the world's corporations to plunder as they please. Tell them you insist on the triple bottom line. The mining and petroleum laws must be changed to reflect that, not the opposite. We can be so much more than the world's quarry. Our future's calculated by corporations, and we need not be helpless to stop it. Speak up for the smart, sustainable and humane Australia we could be instead.